Hello everyone, it's Emma O'Dooher here. Just wanted to give you some extra video footage to support your preparations for the beginning teachers learning, professional learning you are going to be offering to mentors in the new year. So I'm just going to dip into certain slides as indicated in the professional learning plan. So I'm not going to elaborate on all of the slides and materials, just the ones that perhaps you might benefit from hearing someone else elaborating on to help assist you in your preparation. Of course, feel free to completely discard what how I'm presenting it and do it in your own way. That's totally up to you. All I've done is gone to the relevant sort of chapter of the Beginning Teachers Learning Bernhager and Mutton book and tried to sort of synthesize it to prepare for my explanation that you're about to hear, and to give plenty of examples as well for mentors. So without further ado then, I'm going to start with the slides that give some sort of direct instruction, if you will, about what research tells us about beginning teachers as learners. So starting with this first one that you've got in front of you, and I'm just going to present it in the way that I would if I were you to the mentors. Okay, so what do we know about beginning teachers as learners? Well, we know that they have already served a long apprenticeship of observation in teaching and learning because they have been learners themselves. And they come to initial teacher education and indeed the NQT year with firmly rooted conceptions about how it works, as well as confidence in their ability to judge the effectiveness of teaching because they have had lots of teachers in their time. And these deeply entrenched images of teaching and effective teachers, in air quotation marks, can be both positive and negative. They can be models of teaching that they really accept. So, teachers that from their experience they felt were really great and impactful, or visions of and images of teachers that they passionately reject for one reason or another. And their prior experience of teaching can also influence their view of pedagogy, so strategies that they accept and reject. A good example of this that comes from the book is a beginning teacher who really rejects group work because of the negative experiences she had of group work as a learner. And their views of learners can also be significantly influenced by their prior experience. And again, those can be both positive and negative perspectives of learners. So, consequently, you as mentors need to take the time to understand these preconceptions that the student teachers and the NQTs come to you already possessing. And from there, to find points of connection with them when they're with you, and to encourage beginning teachers to reflect on them, to evaluate them, and most importantly, to interrogate them in order to reach a sort of refreshed view of teaching and learning. If mentors don't do that, then the beginning teacher might adopt a form of what's known as strategic compliance. So they'll do what you say to pass their assessment, to pass QTS, or to meet the descriptors for newly qualified teachers. But they might then be at risk of reverting back to their old ways afterwards. So it's through that process of sort of getting those preconceptions out there, using them as a point of reflection for student teachers or NQTs, causing them to sort of really reflect on them in light of what they're experiencing with you, either on clinical practice or in their NQT year. So that they can interrogate them and hopefully over time come to reach a new view. They may also, with regard to their preconceptions, have overly simplified views of the process of learning to teach and what it entails. They might not fully understand the intricate steps, the cognitive processes, and the skills required in judging the impact of their practice as teachers. They might have a really simplified view that they're going to do a lot of planning, do a lot of teaching, do some observing, but they might not really understand the really intricate processes of using their research and inquiry time to reflect and evaluate on their impact. Processes like or approaches like considering the pupil's work and the pupil's perspectives really carefully as an indicator of the impact of what they're doing in the classroom. The importance of considering how effectively their plan worked in reality. So not simply planning lesson to lesson, but looking back at the original plan and comparing it with how things played out in the classroom in order to take a really sort of deliberative approach to their next steps. So if they've got that simplified view of what learning to teach is all about, and it also if you as the mentor fail to recognise that your beginning teacher views the process of learning to teach in a particular way, then the student teacher or the NQT might miss opportunities, or sorry, you as the mentor might miss opportunities to intervene and improve their approach to learning from experience. For example, if you've got a student who thinks that they learn best from sort of trial and error, and they've taught the same lesson 3 times over, and hopefully by the 3rd time they'll get it right, they might, if you don't address that, they might fail to adopt a much more sort of deliberative approach to their practice, a much more reflective approach to their practice. So some important things to know about preconceptions from the off when you start working with beginning teachers. We also know that there are common stages in beginning teachers' development, such as this sort of 3-stage model moving outwards from beginning teachers being concerned with themselves and self-survival, moving out to concerns about the classroom tasks that they need to undertake, and then finally moving to a concern about pupils and their learning. However, a note of caution about how beginning teachers learn. They're not necessarily neatly going to move through a sequential trajectory like that. There will be individual variation because, as we know, learners don't deal with different issues in a neat sequential fashion. So research tells us that beginning teachers more commonly deal with simultaneous rather than sequential concerns. For example, they're not all consumed with behaviour management before anything else. They are concerned about behaviour management, but not above everything else. So mentors therefore need to support their beginning teachers by scaffolding linkages between the pupils' learning and the practices that they've been using in the class, but also to wider learning theory to help them make sense of how their practice is developing and evolving over time. And what they shouldn't do is simply focus heavily on behaviour management right at the off, and that taking precedence above all else, or taking being privileged above all other opportunities to learn. Learning from experience is vital for beginning teachers, but it's also multifaceted. It's not a simple process of observation, planning, teaching and evaluating. We know that it also includes the development of judgment, as I mentioned on the previous slide. It involves careful evaluation of outcomes by drawing on a range of evidence, and part of that being the evidence from the learners themselves. It involves deliberate experimentation with ideas. So beginning teachers need to take on board the ideas suggested by you, the mentor, but also from university, which is giving them that broader perspective. And they need to be given the opportunity to deliberately experiment with those ideas. They also need to reflect on what they realise they still have to learn. So given that time and space for regular reflection. Bernhager and Mutton's research on beginning teachers learning tells us that they will display different orientations to facets of learning from experience, which might help or hinder their learning. For example, if you've got a student teacher or a beginning teacher who is sort of predisposed towards receiving feedback really openly, and they view it in a positive manner, as being essential to their learning, if they view it in that way and they're really open to it, they might be more inclined to act upon it. And those who have a tendency towards the opposite orientation, they tend to be disabled by feedback, becoming quite emotional about feedback, and not necessarily knowing how to move forward based on that feedback, then they are not necessarily going to thrive from that feedback. And it's going to have implications for you, the mentor, in how you support them in responding to feedback, depending on their orientation towards it. So knowing and understanding the beginning teacher's orientation towards learning from experience can help you as the mentor to seek to promote and instill more positive approaches to learning from experience within your beginning teachers. So we're going to go into much more depth and detail about orientations to learning from experience later in this presentation, but for now it's just important to know that they do orientate themselves differently towards the different facets of learning from experience. I think we all know this, but it's important to remember that the research supports it too. So multiple studies with beginning teachers have emphasised the fact that learning to teach is an emotionally charged process. And it's really essential that mentors remember this. The challenges of establishing a new identity and building productive relationships with both pupils and colleagues make it emotionally charged. And beginning teachers' preconceptions of success and failure are powerfully amplified in that process and by that process. What they're constantly doing is balancing competing identities. They've got to be appear to be a professional at all times and straight away, but that can sometimes be in conflict with their identity as a learner, because part of being a learner is making mistakes and learning from them. And that can be, in tension with the sort of professional identity of the beginning teacher. So it can be really difficult for beginning teachers to reconcile those tensions. And the mentor, therefore, plays a really important role in recognising that it's an emotional process, in recognising that they're grappling with this dual identity, and acknowledge that vulnerability when they present advice or feedback. So I suppose remembering themselves that although that they have developed a lot of expertise and confidence as a teacher themselves, they're always still learning. And I think sometimes sort of presenting yourself to the student teacher or to the NQT as a learner who also makes mistakes occasionally can really help the student teacher to adopt that dual identity. It's important to reinforce at this stage, however, that you want to develop productive working relationships with your student teacher, and you want to sort of acknowledge the emotional vulnerabilities that they will be experiencing and feeling. However, it's still important to maintain that professional distance as a coach rather than a counsellor, or as a mentor rather than a counsellor. So although we want you to acknowledge it, it is important to remember that there are always other agencies, whether they're an NQT or whether they're a student teacher, professionals who are there to support the student teacher if they're experiencing issues beyond the realm of your ability and knowledge to support, such as mental health issues. Okay, so the other thing that we know about beginning teachers as learners is that they draw upon and use several different types of knowledge to learn and to inform their practice. And we're going to have a look at those now. So here you can see that student teachers, albeit their sort of day-to-day activity when learning from experience on placement or in their first year of their first teaching post, they'll be planning, they'll be teaching, they'll be evaluating. A lot of streams of knowledge are brought to bear on that process, and they go through a process of integrating, of synthesizing those different streams of knowledge, of interrogating them, of evaluating them in order to plan, to teach and to evaluate. The first form of knowledge is intellectual knowledge. Of course, they engage with theory that they get from university or from professional learning that they engage in. Any intellectual knowledge that they have encountered, learned, developed in their degree study or as they're going through their degree, and also any intellectual knowledge that is developed through things such as school-led training days or equivalent on their PGCE or ITE programs, any books, articles that they're engaging with. So various different streams of intellectual knowledge they will draw upon to inform their planning, teaching and evaluating. They will develop knowledge about learners, and that is knowledge about learners more generally, talked about preconceived ideas that student teachers might have about learners. Some of those may not be altogether helpful. They may hold deficit perspectives about learners. But as they develop, they will come to know the learners they're working with. They will be privy to data about learners, but they will also gain a lot from getting to know those learners as they get to come to teach them more and come to know them better. So they're also drawing upon that knowledge of their learners in order to plan, to teach and to evaluate. They gain knowledge through teaching. It's really important to emphasise the significance of experience and learning through teaching to student teachers. They value it very highly in terms of their own learning. But there are a lot of sort of challenges and opportunities that they experience when they're learning through teaching. Early on, they are observing a great deal, but when they come to team teach and teach independently, they're coming to reflect in action as they're teaching, but also after the fact on action. And there's a lot of support that a mentor can give in helping them to really get the most of learning through teaching. What we also know is that they learn from the professional practical knowledge of established teachers like you, the mentor, who is working very closely with them, and others who you signpost them to, who they observe when they're on placement, but also in their NQT year. What we do know is that accessing the professional practical knowledge or tacit knowledge, sometimes referred to as knowledge in use of established teachers, can be quite difficult for student teachers because we don't always articulate it. We don't always give them a play-by-play of what we did and why we did it in that moment in the process of a lesson. So it's important to know how powerful that is for student teachers, and therefore do all that you can to make it visible, make the implicit explicit to your student teacher or to the NQT that you're working with. We also know, and I've gone into a lot of detail about this, that already, that personal knowledge, identity and beliefs also have a very strong bearing and influence on student teachers planning, teaching and evaluating. And then finally, the knowledge that they gain through indirect practical learning. Now, this tends to happen in their initial teacher education experiences. When they come to university, they are not getting direct classroom experience, but they're getting indirect opportunities to learn. For example, they might engage in micro teaching, where they plan a small portion of a lesson that they team teach to their peers at university. They might experience and observe what we call approximations of practice. So a university tutor might model a classroom scenario or provide case studies, video footage to student teachers, thereby giving them indirect practical learning experience. And I suppose the beauty of that is that the university-based teacher educator can sort of slow down the process of learning for the student teacher. They can pause the video footage, they can model something, then ask questions of the student teachers. It's things that you tend to not be able to do as easily when you're working with live pupils in a classroom context. So really important to note that they've got all of those streams of knowledge that are really, really important to their development as a beginning teacher, and that they will need support and help in integrating, in understanding, and in knowing how to apply to their own planning, teaching, and evaluating. So that concludes the section from the start of the professional learning that you're going to offer, which is the sort of direct instruction bit. I'm going to move on now. I'm going to skip over a few slides, and I'm going to take you to the slide regarding student teachers' orientations to learning from experience, because you might want to sort of do a bit of preparation about how you explain this to mentors in the session. I found, having delivered this myself in professional learning contexts, it's really useful to give concrete examples to mentors. So I'm going to model that to you now. So we've got a table here that has come from the work of Hager et al., who did a lot of research into the different ways that student teachers and NQTs learn from experience, and it helped them produce 5 dimensions according to which trainees' orientations to learning from experience might differ. So firstly, we've got the level of aspiration. So when learning from experience, the trainee will have aspiration for their own and their pupils' learning. And they might be orientated towards being quite satisfied with their current level of achievement, or conversely, they might aspire both as learners and as teachers. So I suppose if they're orientated to being satisfied with their current level of achievement, the risk there is that they think that they know all there is to know, and that they potentially plateau because they haven't got that sense of aspiration. They're not hungry to continue to learn and aspire to learn from their own experience, but also to aspire for their own teaching practice, but also aspire for their pupils' learning to improve and increase. So depending on how they're orientated might influence the way that they are managing their own time, using their own PPA time, and sort of operating generally when they're a beginning teacher. Their level of intentionality is the extent to which the trainee's learning is planned. You may have a beginning teacher who could be described as being quite reactive, so they wait until after the fact before they begin to try to intervene or change things. An example of this relating to one of the case studies from Bernhager and Mutton's work is that you might have a student teacher or a beginning teacher who tends to teach multiple lessons and hope that by the last one they will have nailed it, it will be perfect. It's quite a reactive approach to planning their learning. If they're more deliberative, they might be much more intentional about trying to plan for the best possible outcomes for their learners. And they might be more inclined to consider the different classes that they're working with more carefully. If they're teaching the same lesson to different classes, so the same lesson multiple times, they might be much more deliberative in thinking about the pupils in those classes, how they differ, the different dynamics, their capabilities, etc., any data they have on them, and take a much more deliberative approach. With regard to their frame of reference, this is the value that the trainee ascribes to looking beyond their experience in order to make sense of it. You might have a beginning teacher who exclusively relies on the experience of classroom teaching as a frame of reference in making sense of teaching and learning. Or you might have a beginning teacher who values drawing upon a range of sources to shape and make sense of their experience. Of course, if they exclusively rely on what they're experiencing in the classroom, it might have a knock-on effect on their level of aspiration for themselves and for the pupils that they're working with. We know that by looking to theory, looking outside your own classroom and collaborating with other practitioners, be that in the same school or in a different school, looking to literature, drawing upon a range of different sources can give you a much more well-rounded view of teaching and learning, and give you much more ideas to draw upon in order to provide the best possible learning experience for pupils, but to also to help you grow and develop as a teacher. So their frame of reference is really important to consider. This is one that maybe is the easiest to understand and to sort of resonate with as a mentor. And this is the trainee or the beginning teacher's orientation or disposition towards receiving feedback and the value that they attribute to it. If they've got a tendency to be disabled by critical feedback, they might be less inclined to want to take it on board. It might affect the relationship between mentor and beginning teacher. It might also sort of limit them in their ability to think critically about their feedback without the support of a mentor. Conversely, if they are inclined or orientated to effective use of feedback to further learning, they're really open to it, they welcome it, then that's potentially going to give them a better relationship with critical feedback, and it's also going to help them to act upon the feedback and move forward in order to advance their practice. And of course, when you know this of student teachers, it can influence the approach that you take as a mentor, and it can help you to help them perhaps tip the balance in favour of a more positive orientation towards learning from experience. Finally, we've got their attitude to context. So this is the attitude to the positions in which the beginning teachers find themselves and the approaches that they take to the school context. So we know that student teachers in particular tend to find themselves in more than one school placement. And so when they come to that new context, their preconceived ideas, their dispositions, their behaviours will cause them to view that context in a particular way. And likewise, when they become an NQT in their first job, they will also be have a particular attitude towards the particular context that they're in. So if they have a tendency to regard the context as constraining, that might have some potentially negative consequences for them, their practice, and the young people that they're working with. An example of this is perhaps they have found themselves either on placement or in their first job in a school that serves a community with high levels of socioeconomic deprivation. And as is often, although not always the case in those contexts, many pupils with particularly low levels of literacy. And an example of that might be their reading ages might be particularly low. A student teacher who regards that as a constraint and perhaps adopts or holds a deficit perspective of the pupils and the broader community could be really limited and could limit opportunities with regard to teaching and learning if they see the context as constraining. So, for example, they might present attitudes of not necessarily blame, but they might refer to parents and carers not supporting pupils reading at home. And so will perhaps see any efforts that they attempt to implement in the classroom as being in vain in trying to improve reading levels amongst their young people. So they might adopt this sort of deficit perspective, and then ultimately that orientation is them perceiving of their context as being quite constraining to what they can do with regard to teaching and learning. However, if they accept the context and see it as an opportunity to capitalise on that context, perhaps a particular school, such as the example I gave, have got some really great initiatives that they're trying to roll out in order to support parents and carers and pupils in developing their literacy levels, and in particular their reading. They might be inclined to really try to understand those initiatives, those interventions. They might even be inclined to, when they get research and inquiry opportunities, to read up on it and to really try and capitalise on what's going on in that context. Another example might be that the beginning teacher might find themselves in a school that has got a particularly strict policy on seating plans, on the organisation of classroom seating plans, and also on group work. So let's say, for instance, you've got a school who insist that classrooms must be set up in rows, and that group work should be kept to a minimum. Now, a student teacher or a beginning teacher in that context might see this as really constraining, might avoid opportunities to get pupils to engage in any kind of peer discussion or group work, and they might not even try to get to understand the reason for this. Conversely, they might sort of try to rage against it. And they might do that without taking the step of trying to understand the context before being able to capitalise on it. So a student teacher that's more orientated towards acceptance of the context and ability to capitalise on it would try to understand why the school is adopting that particular approach, to work with the mentor closely to capitalise on opportunities to develop pupils' interaction with one another, their ability to learn together, but within the confines of the policy that the school has got for a particular reason. So lots of examples there. I'm sure that you can think of other better examples of this, but it's really important that the mentors that you're presenting to understand these different dimensions and orientations before they come to look at the next slide, which is all about different types of feedback. So you'll present the mentors attending your professional learning with these four types of and approaches to feedback. And I think it's really important to emphasize with mentors that this isn't a sort of hierarchy, because any one of these approaches might be appropriate at different times for beginning teachers. They're just different types that we might see being conducted between mentor and beginning teacher in the field. So the first is mentor-led. So it might be that the mentor, after an observation, goes through what they perceive to be the strengths and areas for development that the student teacher or beginning teacher displayed in that particular lesson. The second type is encouraging much more metacognitive conversations. And this is where the mentor encourages the student teacher to unpick their learning and teaching intentions versus the reality of what happened in the lesson observation. So it might be that they sit there with the lesson plan in front of the student And they encourage the student teacher to consider whether what they intended for pupils' learning and how they intended to address that through their teaching practice, how that played out in practice, whether it had impact, if not, why not. So encouraging much more reflection on intention versus reality in order for the student teacher to reflect, evaluate, and so change their approach later on or act upon what they've learned from that metacognitive conversation. The third type of feedback is delayed feedback conversations. Now, this does put quite a lot of emphasis on the beginning teacher to go away and reflect before they come to discuss the feedback conversation with the mentor. So this is where the beginning teacher must self-reflect first, rather than seek to receive immediate validation from their mentor. They go away, they think perhaps they could do something similar to what I mentioned a moment ago by going back to their lesson plan, evaluating the learning, considering the efficacy of their teaching approaches, to come to the mentor then with what they perceive to be the strengths and areas for development, so that they can have a conversation with the mentor that is very much led by the beginning teacher. And then finally, clinical reasoning approach. And this is where the mentor uses clinical reasoning conversation prompts to promote critical reflection and reciprocal inquiry with their beginning teacher. And it's here that I'm just going to stop sharing. And I'm going to turn your attention to the clinical reasoning crib sheet. And the reason why I'm doing that is I'm going to just talk you through how I might break down the 4 elements of clinical reasoning for mentors if I was leading the professional learning session. So you're going to be providing your mentors with this crib sheet. And what we recommend that you do is that you take them through the 4 elements of clinical reasoning before you give them the opportunity to read the clinical reasoning conversation prompts. Because if they don't really understand the elements of it, then the questions might be difficult to consider with application, in the context of a conversation between a beginning teacher and mentor. So the 4 elements of clinical reasoning. Now, what I tend to do, first of all, when I'm presenting this for the first time to mentors is to emphasise that clinical reasoning is the process that they tend to go through as expert teachers themselves on a day-to-day basis. But it's a process that needs to really be taught and instilled within the student teacher or the beginning teacher so that it becomes second nature to them. We can't anticipate that they will be able to engage in analytical and intuitive cognitive processes that professionals do in order to arrive at a best judged ethical response in a specific practice-based context. So we take them through this process of clinical reasoning in order to ensure that they've got the skills to do that on their own later on down the line. So the first element of clinical reasoning is that it is a respectful and reciprocal dialogue, and it's characterised by listening. It's an open dialogue, but most importantly, it takes skillful prompting on behalf of the mentor. Now, I think it's probably good to emphasise at this point that listening not only refers to the beginning teacher, but also to the mentor listening to their student teacher, their beginning teacher, in order to help them. And the skillful prompting suggests a much more sort of intentional approach to feedback and to supporting the development of student teachers learning through feedback, because those questions are encouraging them to reflect on what's happened in the context of a lesson or in a broader context of how they're trying to improve their practice. So the second element is iterative use of data and evidence, and this refers to the ways in which mentors and student teachers, or NQTs, draw on classroom data and theory to support evaluations and well-reasoned designs for next steps in teaching. And I think emphasises this element because it's suggesting that not only should the mentor be encouraging the student, teacher, or the NQT to consider what happened in the lesson that they could observe, so classroom data being what they saw the pupils doing, what they heard them say, the work that they were producing, all of those things that give us an indication as to whether or not the strategies we're using had impact. It also emphasises the importance of looking to theory in order to support their evaluations, and to sort of move them away from that orientation to being exclusively reliant on the experience of classroom teaching as a frame of reference, as we mentioned earlier in the professional learning. The third element of clinical reasoning is that the student has to articulate their reasoning. It makes their learning visible. So by asking these important questions of the student, teacher, or the NQT, they're getting them to demonstrate what they know, why they did what they did, what they think it means, demonstrating if they can assess the impact it had. But if you do it the other way around and student teachers are asking these questions of the mentor, it can make the mentor's tacit knowledge accessible to the student teacher. And then finally, really important part of clinical reasoning is that it seeks to interrupt or probe personal assumptions and theories about teaching and learning that the student teacher might hold. And as it says there in the crib sheet, it's essential to supporting a more critical orientation towards improving teaching. It interrupts unquestioning acceptance and imitation of existing beliefs and practices. And if we go back to some of the examples that I gave earlier in this recording, it might cause them to question why pupils are struggling with their reading, or why it might be inappropriate at this moment in time to introduce group work based on, the policies that the school has got, or how they might introduce it in a much more incremental way that's not going to be counter to the policies of the school and what they're trying to do with the learners. So it can really interrupt that deficit, or those deficit perspectives, cognitive biases that the student teachers might hold. So that's how I would break that down before getting mentors to have a look at the question prompts, the conversation prompts, and considering how they might be applied after an observation, when discussing a student teacher's or NQT's lesson plan, multiple applications. But most importantly, it's going to be for them to also reflect on when they might use clinical reasoning instead of a more mentor-led approach to giving feedback. At what point they might use clinical reasoning as an alternative form of feedback, and why they might use it at a particular time. Okay. I'm going to stop the recording there. Hopefully that's given you enough information to support your preparation for the professional learning that you're going to deliver. And of course, you've got the opportunity to ask questions in the drop-in session down the line too. Thank you very much for listening, and good luck with your sessions.